June 15, 1944. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The Pacific sun burned white across the volcanic ridges, shimmering off steel and sand. Sherman tanks rolled ashore through curtains of smoke, their engines screaming under the strain of coral dust and tropical heat. Marines pushed inland through cane fields and broken palms, where Japanese artillery carved the ground into fire and thunder. Inside one tank, sweat poured like rainwater. The engine temperature spiked, red needles trembling on every dial. Dozens of Shermans were stalling across the ridge, their engines choking on heat and dust. But one machine, its side marked with soot and patches of welded steel, kept climbing. Its exhaust roared clear and strong, its engine cooler than any other in the company. The secret wasn't factory engineering. It was the work of a single field mechanic who had broken every maintenance rule in the manual. An unapproved cooling modification, dismissed by superiors, now kept an entire tank crew alive in the inferno of Saipan's hills. As other Shermans failed and burned, his unauthorized idea turned into something greater. A quiet act of defiance that would change how men fought, fixed, and survived. Before the Sherman tank reached Saipan's black volcanic soil, the island itself had already been marked on American maps as the stepping stone to Japan. The summer of 1944 brought Operation Forager, the U.S. offensive to seize the Marianas. Control of Saipan meant airfields for the B-29 superfortresses, putting Tokyo within range for the first time. It also meant a fierce and inevitable battle. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, followed by the Army's 27th Infantry Division, landed on the western beaches under a sky thick with naval fire. The USS Pennsylvania and her sister battleships filled the horizon, hammering Japanese fortifications that had survived weeks of bombardment. The defenders, roughly 30,000 men under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, were dug deep into caves and ridgelines, their artillery hidden among the coral hills. Every foot of the island was designed to kill. The Sherman M4, the workhorse of American armor, was chosen to support the Marines' advance. On paper, it was the perfect tool, reliable, fast, adaptable. But the Pacific was not North Africa or Normandy. Here, the heat was unrelenting, humidity corroded steel overnight, and volcanic ash crept into every joint and seal. Within hours of landing, mechanics were pulling overheated Shermans off the beaches, their engines boiling over, transmissions grinding, fans choking on dust that turned into thick paste inside radiators. For crews trapped in metal under that sun, heat became a silent enemy. Inside the hull, temperatures exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews fought exhaustion as much as they fought the Japanese. Radiator hoses burst mid-combat. Oil thinned and leaked under pressure. Engines seized halfway up Saipan's ridges, leaving tanks immobile targets for Japanese anti-tank guns. Each Sherman carried its own small team of miracle workers, field mechanics who followed behind the armor columns, tools strapped to half-tracks, hands perpetually burned and blackened. Their job was to make sure these machines, already battered from years of war, could survive terrain no engineer had designed them for. They worked through nights, scavenging parts from destroyed tanks, improvising with salvaged metal and ration tins. There was no glory, no medals, only grease, exhaustion, and the unspoken understanding that a single repair could decide whether a tank crew lived or died. Among them was a junior mechanic attached to the 4th Marine Division's Tank Battalion, a man known among his peers for ignoring procedure when the manual didn't make sense. His name would fade into logistics reports and maintenance rosters, but his actions during the Saipan campaign would echo through field workshops long after the battle. He had seen too many engines fail under the same conditions and refused to believe that overheating was inevitable. The standard procedure was to clear filters, flush radiators, and replace fan belts. But he noticed the real problem lay deeper. the airflow design itself. The Sherman's rear engine compartment, optimized for temperate climates, trapped heat once dust sealed its vents. He began experimenting quietly during pre-invasion maintenance aboard transport ships, reshaping vent covers, redirecting air channels, and reinforcing filters using wire mesh scavenged from landing craft decks. His modification wasn't authorized. It risked disciplinary action if discovered. Yet, he pressed on, believing that a tank that couldn't breathe couldn't fight. By the time his unit landed on Saipan, his modified Sherman carried a crude but functional cooling system, one that allowed cleaner airflow and expelled heat faster than the regulation setup. Other mechanics dismissed it as reckless tinkering, but the results spoke for themselves. When other tanks stalled climbing the volcanic ridges, his machine ran cooler, its crew surviving where others cooked inside their armor. In the Pacific Theater, innovation was rarely born in laboratories. It was forged under fire, shaped by necessity. Improvisation became a culture, from pilots adjusting fuel mixtures mid-air to infantrymen crafting makeshift flamethrowers. Mechanics were no different. Every rule in the manual existed to protect machines from men who didn't understand them. But men who truly understood the machines often had to break those very rules to save them. As Saipan's hills turned into a furnace of smoke and molten sand, the battlefield would soon prove whether his defiance was foolish or revolutionary. By the third day of fighting, Saipan had already earned its name among the Marines. Hell with a shoreline. The terrain was unlike anything most American tankers had ever faced. Instead of open plains, they encountered a twisted landscape of cliffs, gullies, and shattered coral ridges that chewed through treads like knives. The Japanese defenders fought not for ground, but for delay, transforming every ridge into a fortress and every crater into a trap. For the tank battalions supporting the infantry, the battle became a brutal experiment in survival. Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns were hidden in caves, their muzzles camouflaged with branches. Infantry carrying magnetic mines rushed from the jungle, vanishing after each strike. The Shermans were not just advancing. They were climbing through fire. Their engines, already burdened by the tropical heat, began to fail in clusters. Some tanks simply shut down mid-assault, forcing their crews to abandon them under incoming mortar fire. In the command posts behind the lines, reports flooded in: engine overheating, multiple units immobilized. Maintenance crews were ordered to prioritize recovery, but the reality was grim. There were no spare engines, no replacement radiators, and no shade. Tanks were repaired in the open, tools slipping from sweat-soaked hands as shells screamed overhead. It was in this desperate environment that unorthodox mechanics became indispensable. The young mechanic who had altered his Sherman's cooling system found himself in constant motion, fixing, adjusting, cleaning. His modified design, once mocked, now drew the attention of officers who were running out of functioning armor. The change was simple in principle. By widening the rear vent channels, reinforcing the intake mesh, and rerouting exhaust flow to prevent back pressure, he reduced internal temperature spikes by nearly 20%. In field conditions, that difference meant life or death. Word spread quietly through the ranks. Other crews began seeking his help, asking him to replicate his hack. It wasn't officially sanctioned, and the battalion's engineering officer warned him that unauthorized modifications could lead to formal reprimand. But in the field, authority often bent before necessity. The mechanic worked through the nights, crawling beneath hot steel, tightening bolts by flashlight, his uniform drenched in oil and dust. The tactical consequences began to show. On the western ridge near Garapan, a platoon equipped with several modified Shermans managed to advance farther inland than any previous armored group. Their tanks maintained consistent speed without stalling, allowing infantry to follow in coordinated assaults. For the first time, armor was keeping pace with the battle instead of lagging behind it. The U.S. command didn't record the mechanic's name in after-action reports. What they did record, however, was a marked improvement in Sherman operational rates across the second week of the battle. Where earlier days saw nearly half of armored units sidelined by mechanical failure, the numbers began to climb back toward full strength. The combination of improvisation and sheer determination restored mobility to forces that had been fighting uphill against both terrain and machine. Meanwhile, Japanese defenders recognized the renewed threat. They began concentrating artillery fire on the ridges where American tanks advanced, creating infernos of shrapnel and rock. Each Sherman that survived these barrages owed as much to its crew's endurance as to the hidden adjustments inside its hull. The unapproved cooling hack was now silently influencing the rhythm of the campaign. Behind the front line, maintenance officers gradually acknowledged that something extraordinary was happening. They started experimenting with their own variations, adjusting fan speeds, modifying vent placements, and improving filter seals. None of it was officially recorded until months later, when similar techniques were noted in technical bulletins circulated through Pacific repair depots. The innovation had spread, but its origin remained buried in the chaos of Saipan. By late June, the island's outcome was no longer in doubt. U.S. forces had broken through to the eastern shore, cutting the Japanese in two. Yet, the lessons of the battle, about machines, men, and the fragile boundary between regulation and improvisation, were only beginning to unfold. Soon, the fight would shift from terrain to endurance, and the mechanic's defiance would face its greatest test under direct fire. In the grinding chaos of Saipan, where heat shimmered like glass and exhaustion turned men hollow-eyed, the line between survival and collapse often depended on one man's willingness to act differently. Mechanics were invisible soldiers. They didn't carry rifles into battle, yet they stood among the wreckage of both metal and men, rebuilding life from ruin. The young mechanic with the unapproved cooling hack had no command rank, no medal on his chest, only calloused hands and a stubborn refusal to let machines die before their crews did. Each day began the same: a low hum of engines, a wall of humidity, and the smell of fuel blending with salt. He'd crawl beneath stalled tanks, cutting his palms on jagged bolts, working while tracers lit the sky in the distance. There was no certainty that his fixes would hold. Yet, when a Sherman rolled back into combat with smoke running clean instead of black, he knew his work had meaning. These field mechanics embodied the human heart of industrial warfare. Ordinary men turning mechanical despair into persistence, one wrench turn at a time. The Sherman M4's design reflected the priorities of a global war: mass production, interchangeable parts, and general reliability. What it lacked, however, was environmental specialization. In the humid Pacific, its air-cooled systems and vent placements created a dangerous flaw: trapped heat. The mechanic's modification, though crude, targeted that problem directly. By expanding the intake aperture and reorienting exhaust flow, he created a primitive version of what later engineers would describe as direct thermal venting. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The adjustment allowed hotter air to escape instead of recirculating inside the compartment. It also improved dust expulsion, a feature critical in Saipan's terrain, where fine volcanic ash coated everything like powder. While official manuals warned against unauthorized changes due to potential engine imbalance, this particular alteration achieved the opposite: smoother running, fewer seizures, and extended operational time. Technicians studying post-battle reports later realized that similar results would have required an entirely new cooling assembly if done through official channels. Instead, one field improvisation had achieved it with tools no more advanced than a cutting torch, scrap mesh, and courage. When tanks overheat, battles slow. Infantry lose cover. Artillery coordination suffers. On Saipan, where every advance was measured in yards, Such delays could cost dozens of lives. The improved cooling hack, unnoticed in high command reports, indirectly changed tactical outcomes. Platoons with functioning Shermans could sustain pressure longer, forcing Japanese defenders to retreat from fortified positions sooner. One notable incident occurred near Hill 721, where 3 modified Shermans supported the 25th Marines during an afternoon assault. The temperature reached 1 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Ordinary tanks would have overheated after 20 minutes of continuous operation. These 3 ran for nearly 2 hours without incident. Their advance allowed infantry to bypass Japanese ambush points that had previously halted progress for days. The tank's endurance created not just mobility, but morale. Soldiers began to trust the machines again, knowing they wouldn't stall in the heat of combat. For officers calculating battlefield momentum, such reliability was priceless. Tactical superiority often depends not on superior weapons, but on consistency. The assurance that one's tools will not fail mid-strike. On Saipan, that assurance came from a mechanic's defiance. Wartime innovation often clashes with command hierarchy. Military culture values discipline, rules, order, procedure. Yet, within every large force, true progress often arises from those willing to question. The mechanic's decision to alter the Sherman without authorization challenged the rigid structure of wartime maintenance doctrine. His immediate supervisors hesitated to acknowledge his success openly, fearing disciplinary scrutiny from above. But at the company level, tank commanders recognized what mattered most: results. Leaders began unofficially approving the modification, instructing other mechanics to do what he did, without specifying details. It became a whispered form of leadership, the kind where influence spreads not through rank, but through respect. This dynamic, repeated across countless units in the Pacific, demonstrated the fluid relationship between innovation and authority. By quietly enabling non-regulation ingenuity, commanders preserved operational capacity and morale. It was leadership by pragmatism, shaped not in offices, but on burning soil. The Sherman's survival on Saipan wasn't only a story of engineering, it was a story of command flexibility under the strain of total war. To the Japanese defenders, the American tanks symbolized relentless advance. Early in the battle, they noticed that U.S. armor often halted mid-assault, leaving gaps exploitable for counterattacks. But as modified Shermans began to appear, their patterns changed. Tanks pushed deeper, longer, and faster. Japanese gunners reported frustration. Rounds that once found stationary targets now chased moving armor. Observers on both sides realized something subtle had shifted. For the defenders, it meant recalculating their ambush timing. For the Americans, it meant confidence. A psychological weapon as potent as firepower. The mechanic's unseen alteration had turned into an invisible edge. Each engine that kept roaring under the Pacific sun carried not just its crew, but the echo of that defiance. A small, quiet revolution turning mechanical endurance into battlefield dominance. War pushes human limits, not only of courage, but of conscience. The mechanic's unapproved modification, though born from necessity, walked a fine line between ingenuity and insubordination. Military procedure existed for safety. Every unauthorized change carried risk. Mechanical failure, court-martial, even loss of life. Yet the moral weight of inaction, of watching men burn inside tanks that could have been saved, was heavier still. In letters sent months later from forward repair depots, some mechanics admitted that Saipan had changed how they viewed duty. It was no longer just obedience to orders, but responsibility to outcome. If saving lives meant bending regulations, then bending them became a duty of its own. This quiet moral rebellion, guided not by arrogance but by compassion, defined a generation of unsung soldiers who chose initiative over fear. The line between discipline and humanity blurred on Saipan's hills. Each unapproved modification, each defiance of the manual, whispered the same truth. Sometimes victory belongs not to those who follow perfectly, but to those who care enough to act when rules fall short. The Pacific Campaign was a logistical nightmare. Every spare part had to travel thousands of miles across open ocean. Replacement engines were rare, and supply ships faced constant threats from submarines and air raids. Mechanics often received mismatched components from older models or salvaged tanks. In this environment, improvisation wasn't creativity, it was survival. The cooling hack spread through field workshops like a rumor that refused to die. Crews passing through Saipan to Tinian or Guam carried the story forward. Find a way to open the vents. It keeps the engines running. Some units began pre-landing modifications based solely on word of mouth. Without formal documentation, these adjustments evolved differently in every battalion, each shaped by available tools and imagination. By late 1944, repair depots in the Pacific began reporting unusually high operational consistency in modified Shermans. Investigations traced it back to these field innovations. The Army Ordnance Department would later codify similar design elements in technical bulletins, subtly acknowledging the power of unofficial ingenuity. Behind the bureaucracy, however, remained the invisible fingerprints of one Saipan mechanic whose idea had outpaced regulation. A tank crew's faith in their machine determines how they fight. Before Saipan, Sherman crews often joked grimly about their vehicles being Ronsons. They lit up first time when hit. The combination of thin armor and unreliable engines bred anxiety. Each mission began with doubt. Would the engine hold? Would the transmission seize under fire? When the modified tanks started outperforming the rest, confidence returned. Crews who knew their machines could endure fought differently. They advanced faster, took calculated risks, and coordinated with infantry more aggressively. Morale surged across units using modified Shermans. In the chaos of Saipan, where exhaustion and fear eroded mental endurance, even a small increase in trust meant everything. Psychologists studying post-war combat behavior often found that reliability in equipment directly affected soldier resilience. The unapproved hack, though mechanical in nature, provided psychological armor, reassurance that human ingenuity could still triumph over mechanical frailty. In a war defined by industrial scale, that feeling restored the sense of agency to individual men. Every battlefield innovation carries symbolism beyond its mechanics. The cooling hack represented something deeply American in the character of the war: improvisation as virtue. The U.S. military, though vast and procedural, relied on individuals willing to act beyond the book when circumstances demanded it. The same spirit that built airstrips overnight and turned cargo planes into bombers pulsed through this one act of defiance. The mechanic's decision was symbolic of the war's essence: adaptation. Machines, like men, had to evolve or perish. His small act, reshaping a vent, rethinking airflow, embodied the resilience of a nation constantly learning from failure. It was proof that ingenuity could exist even in exhaustion, that courage didn't always wear stripes or stars. When historians later examined Saipan's technical after-action reports, few details remained about who first made the change. But veterans who served there remembered. To them, it wasn't just a mechanical fix. It was hope welded into steel. In the years following Saipan, engineers revisited every detail of Pacific armor performance. The lessons learned on those volcanic ridges influenced future designs. Improved ventilation systems, modular filters, and better dust-proofing became standard features in late-war and post-war tanks. Many of these changes echoed the very principles introduced unofficially by field mechanics. The Sherman's successors, like the M26 Pershing, incorporated more efficient cooling layouts. Influenced indirectly by Pacific experience, manuals began including sections on field adaptability, acknowledging what had once been taboo, that battlefield creativity was as vital as blueprint precision. Thus, the unapproved cooling hack became part of an evolutionary chain in armored warfare. Its origin may have been unsanctioned, but its legacy became institutional. The war had transformed experimentation from rebellion into doctrine. For the mechanic himself, the impact was quieter. He didn't see himself as an innovator. His only measure of success was watching a tank return from battle still moving, its crew alive. In his diary, a fragment preserved in a division archive, he wrote, "Engines sound different after they've been through hell. They breathe heavier, like us." That sentence captured what numbers never could: the human bond between man and machine in total war. Every sound, every vibration became personal. Each repair was an act of faith, that one's work, unseen and uncelebrated, might save lives tomorrow. The war would move on, from Saipan to Iwo Jima, from the Pacific to final victory. But that bond of sweat, steel, and defiance would remain a defining story of those who fought not with rifles, but with wrenches and willpower. The morning of June 27, 1944, dawned gray over Saipan's northern ridges. Clouds drifted low, muffling the rumble of armor assembling below the escarpment known as Death Valley, a jagged basin carved by days of relentless shell fire. The 4th Marine Division prepared for one final push to break Japanese resistance before the island's center. In front of them lay concealed bunkers, mortar nests, and a steep incline choked with rubble. Sherman tanks lined up along the slope, their engines coughing awake in unison. Mechanics moved quickly between them, tightening clamps, checking coolant levels, wiping grime from the vents. The mechanic who had introduced the unapproved cooling hack knelt behind his machine, fingers black with oil. He checked the fan belt one last time, feeling it vibrate under his touch, the same machine he had modified weeks earlier aboard the transport ship. At 0830 hours, the order came: advance. The first Shermans lurched forward, their tracks grinding coral into dust. Within minutes, the valley filled with the sharp crack of anti-tank fire. Japanese gunners, hidden in caves along the slope, opened a coordinated barrage. 2 tanks in the lead line burst into flames almost immediately, their ammunition cooking off in orange bursts. Others stalled halfway up the incline, their engines overheating under the combined strain of slope, dust, and panic. The modified Sherman pressed on. Inside, the crew was drenched in sweat, their commander shouting over the roar. The engine temperature climbed dangerously close to red, then steadied. Cool air, drawn through the widened vents, hissed behind them, dispersing the heat that would have killed a standard machine. The tank climbed higher, crushing through barricades, its treads glowing with friction. From the ridge above, Japanese observers couldn't believe what they saw: a lone Sherman refusing to stop, pushing through fire where others lay crippled. Artillery crews redirected every available gun toward it. Mortar shells burst around its hull, showering it in rock and debris. The gunner fired back blindly, bursts of high-explosive shells slamming into cave mouths. Each hit sent shock waves through the ground, echoing across the valley like thunder. The mechanic, now crouched behind the rear plate, monitored the sound of the engine through instinct alone. He could tell its rhythm, its breathing, the way a doctor listens to a pulse. The cooling system held, smoke billowed, but none of it came from within. The modification, simple, forbidden, brilliant, was working under the worst conditions imaginable. Behind him, more tanks tried to follow. One after another, their engines sputtered and failed, each overheating faster than the last. The difference became undeniable. Officers watching from the rear lines began shouting for radio reports. "Find out what that tank's doing different," one demanded. The answer, though technical, was revolutionary. The unauthorized venting system was keeping the machine alive. As the Sherman crested the ridge, its turret turned toward a fortified position hidden behind boulders. A well-camouflaged Japanese 47mm gun waited there, its crew poised for a perfect flank shot. The tank's commander spotted movement, swung the barrel, and fired. The first shell missed, detonating high against rock. The second landed true. The gun emplacement vanished in a cloud of dust and flame. The ridgeline trembled. Infantry, pinned down for hours, surged forward under cover of that explosion. The advance that morning was not smooth. It was brutal, inch by inch. But one tank's endurance changed the tempo. As word spread of the single Sherman that refused to die, morale surged through the line. Mechanics shouted encouragement to one another, hands trembling with adrenaline. Infantrymen cheered as they passed its path, slapping the hull in gratitude before disappearing into the smoke ahead. By noon, the heat inside the tank reached unbearable levels. The crew rotated positions just to stay conscious, faces streaked with soot. Yet still, the engine held. Reports came in that half of the other vehicles in the assault group were immobilized, but the modified Sherman was still advancing. The cooling hack had transformed into a lifeline, a defiance of engineering limits. When the valley finally fell silent in the late afternoon, the smoke cleared to reveal wreckage scattered across the slopes. Most of the Shermans lay smoldering, their hulls blackened. Only a handful remained mobile, among them the mechanic's creation. It sat atop the ridge, idling steadily as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. To the men on the ground, it wasn't just a tank. It was proof that survival could be engineered from courage and intuition. That sometimes one man's refusal to obey the manual could rewrite the outcome of a battle. As dusk settled over the hills of Saipan, the mechanic climbed onto his machine's side, wiping ash from the armor with a rag. The horizon glowed red with the fires of victory, and the hum of his running engine became the quiet heartbeat of triumph. The following day, June 28th, dawned without mercy. Smoke still hung low across the ridges, and the ground trembled as engineers cleared mines from the valley floor. The Americans had broken through the Japanese line, but their advance toward the northern plateau stalled again. Too many tanks disabled, too few still operational. Those that remained formed a small, battered spearhead under constant artillery harassment. The modified Sherman, its engine still intact after the previous day's ordeal, was reassigned to lead the next assault. Its crew, exhausted but defiant, prepared in silence. The mechanic, now a legend among his peers, double-checked every vent and seal, his fingers tracing the same welds he'd made weeks earlier. Around him, men whispered rumors that his machine couldn't overheat, that it had been touched by luck, that it was indestructible. But luck had nothing to do with it. It was design, born of desperation, perfected by instinct. Mati Ornfun, Saudi E-900. As the first artillery shells whistled overhead, the Sherman advanced again, this time along a narrow ridge leading toward Mount Tapachau, Saipan's highest point and the last Japanese stronghold. The terrain was treacherous, the incline steeper than anything the tanks had faced before. Yet the modified engine roared with steady rhythm, climbing without falter. Japanese defenders, aware that armor had survived the previous day's onslaught, redirected heavy mortars toward the lead tank. Shells landed in clusters, hurling dirt and shrapnel across its path. The crew pressed forward regardless, the mechanic shouting readings through the intercom. "Temp steady! Pressure holding!" Behind them, another Sherman faltered, steam venting violently from its rear grille. The driver bailed out moments before a mortar struck it dead on. Flames rose high, silhouetting the lone surviving tank pushing onward. At 10:30 hours, the modified Sherman crested the halfway ridge. Its gunners spotted a series of camouflaged positions ahead. Anti-tank pits and heavy machine guns dug into the slope. The commander ordered high-explosive shells, each shot carving gaps through Japanese defenses. Infantry followed, climbing behind the armor, using its advance as a moving shield. The temperature inside the hull soared again, but the readings remained below the danger threshold. The mechanic's modification, crude, welded, and unapproved, continued to channel heat outward with uncanny efficiency. The crew's confidence grew with every meter. They were no longer merely surviving. They were driving the assault. By noon, the Japanese launched a desperate counterattack. Mortar rounds rained down from hidden positions on the upper slope. A direct hit to the tank's right tread jolted the crew violently, breaking one of the guide teeth. For a brief moment, the machine stalled, caught between motion and immobilization. Then came the crucial decision. Instead of shutting down to prevent overheating, standard protocol, the mechanic urged the driver to keep the engine running. "Don't stop her!" he yelled, hammering his fist on the side panel. "She can take it." The tank lurched forward again, dragging its damaged tread, grinding against the stones like a wounded animal refusing to die. The engine screamed, but the modified vents kept it alive. Against every expectation, the Sherman climbed the final stretch, its barrel blazing. The Japanese fire slackened as positions were overrun, their gunners falling silent one by one. At 1300 hours, the tank reached the upper plateau. The crew emerged briefly to signal the infantry below, a flare streaking red across the sky. It marked the first time American armor had reached that point in the battle. Moments later, supporting troops flooded the ridge, securing it under cover of naval bombardment. The path to Mount Tapocha was open. From command posts on the beachhead, observers watched the single moving dot of armor push across the landscape and sent back a simple message to headquarters: Sherman at summit, still operational. The phrase circulated through the division like wildfire. To every mechanic, tanker, and commander on the island, it became an unspoken symbol of endurance. Proof that human innovation could defy both climate and combat. That night, under the glow of tracer fire fading into the sea, the mechanic sat beside his tank, engine idling softly in the dark. Around him lay the wrecks of machines that had not survived the climb. He said nothing, only listened to the rhythmic hum of the fan, the sound that had saved them all. In the distance, the island still burned, but for the first time in weeks, the air carried something new: relief, pride, and the quiet certainty that a single act of defiance had altered the course of a battle. From that ridge, Saipan would soon fall, and in the silent logs of the armored division, a note appeared beside one entry: cooling system modification, field effective. The mechanic's name didn't follow, but history had already written it in sweat and steel. When the battle for Saipan finally ended on July 9, 1944, the island was a graveyard of metal and men. Nearly 30,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, and over 3,000 American Marines and soldiers had fallen. The heat, the terrain, and the ferocity of the defense had made Saipan one of the costliest battles of the Pacific. Yet among the twisted hulks of Shermans and Type 95 tanks, one machine stood apart. The same Sherman that had defied the odds on the slopes of Mount Tapochau. For 2 more days after the official declaration of victory, engineers combed the hills, documenting wrecks, retrieving usable parts, and salvaging machinery. Word spread quickly through the ranks that one particular tank had completed the entire operation without a single engine failure. Mechanics from other battalions came to inspect it, measuring temperatures, checking coolant lines, and sketching diagrams of its unorthodox venting system. At first, few believed the story. Improvised field modifications rarely worked under such extreme pressure, and official doctrine discouraged unapproved alterations to standardized machinery. But here, the evidence was impossible to ignore. The engine's performance logs, recorded by the crew, showed consistent temperature control even in full combat conditions. The fans, Redirected exhaust lines and heat-channeling ducts had prevented the catastrophic failures that destroyed dozens of other tanks during the campaign. Within days, ordnance officers sent reports up the chain of command. A note attached to the findings read, "Unofficial cooling adjustment. Field verified under sustained combat." It was forwarded to the 5th Amphibious Corps and eventually to naval engineering officers responsible for Pacific operations. Though the mechanic's identity remained buried in field paperwork, his innovation had already begun to travel beyond Saipan. In late July, when the first shipments of damaged tanks were sent back to repair facilities in Hawaii, a few included design notes referencing modified exhaust routing per Saipan field adjustment. The engineers assigned to refurbish them were puzzled and intrigued. They replicated the pattern, tested it under heat, and confirmed what the field crews had witnessed. The Sherman's operating endurance increased significantly, especially in tropical climates. Back on Saipan, the mechanic's own unit was rotated out for rest. They were thinner, quieter, older in expression than when they'd landed. Their tank, scarred, dented, and stained with soot, was parked near the shoreline for inspection. A group of officers visited it that morning, taking photographs and writing down serial numbers. The mechanic watched from a few meters away, arms crossed, unsure whether he should feel pride or apprehension. He had broken the rules, after all, but no reprimand ever came. Instead, the company commander walked over, handed him a folded piece of paper, and said simply, "Your work saved men. That's what matters." Inside was a transfer notice. Temporary reassignment to an ordnance workshop. Not punishment, but opportunity. He was to assist in reviewing armored maintenance protocols for future Pacific operations. It wasn't a medal, and it wasn't fame. Yet, for a man who had fought his war with a wrench and a welder, it meant everything. Meanwhile, the broader consequence of the Saipan campaign echoed across the Pacific. The island's capture brought the U.S. within bombing range of Japan itself. From its airfields, B-29 superfortresses would soon launch raids over Tokyo, marking a new phase in the war. But behind those vast strategic outcomes lay countless smaller acts of ingenuity, each born from necessity, each shaping the tide in unseen ways. Among the soldiers who survived, stories spread of the Invincible Sherman. Some swore its engine never overheated. Others claimed it survived a direct mortar strike without stalling. The myth grew faster than the facts, as myths always do in war. Yet at its core lay a simple truth. A mechanic's refusal to accept failure had changed the endurance of American armor in one of the war's harshest arenas. And though his name never made the official records, his work soon became a quiet benchmark, a proof that adaptation, not obedience, often decided survival. The ripple effects of the modified Sherman extended far beyond the ridges of Saipan. Within weeks, field reports from other Pacific islands began noting improved engine performance in tanks, where mechanics had implemented similar venting adjustments. These were often improvised, unapproved, and varied from unit to unit. But the results were consistent: fewer overheating incidents, higher operational availability, and more sustained advances during combat. Ordnance departments in Hawaii and Guam took notice. While official manuals still forbade unauthorized modifications, the reports prompted a careful study of cooling patterns and engine airflow in tropical conditions. Engineers discovered that the simple alterations pioneered by the Saipan mechanic, vent widening, exhaust rerouting, and reinforced filters, significantly reduced internal heat buildup. In effect, a single field modification was reshaping armored doctrine for the entire Pacific theater. The tactic also influenced operational planning. Commanders became more confident assigning Shermans to extended assaults in harsh terrain, knowing that crews had learned to optimize cooling and manage mechanical stress in ways manuals had never envisioned. This newfound reliability altered timing and coordination, allowing combined infantry and armor units to press Japanese defenses faster and with greater precision. A single mechanic's initiative had translated into measurable battlefield advantage. At the same time, the psychological impact was profound. Soldiers who had witnessed stalled tanks and burnt-out engines now trusted that machines could endure prolonged combat. Confidence spread through ranks like wildfire. Crews felt empowered to experiment safely, adjusting systems in minor ways to prevent predictable failures. The line between sanctioned procedure and battlefield innovation blurred, fostering a culture of practical ingenuity. The mechanic himself never sought recognition. By August 1944, he was stationed at an ordnance facility on Guam, reviewing repair logs, instructing younger mechanics, and quietly demonstrating vent adjustments on Sherman hulls. He received letters of commendation from officers, but his name never appeared in official battle citations. Yet among those who had fought on Saipan, his reputation became legendary. Tank crews would point to surviving Shermans and mutter, "That one runs because of him." In historical accounts, the incident gradually shifted from technical curiosity to symbolic example. Post-war reports emphasized the importance of field adaptability and the human element in armored warfare. Engineers studying tropical tank operations repeatedly cited Saipan as a case where small modifications, born of necessity, not design manuals, saved lives and influenced strategy. The unapproved cooling hack became a foundational anecdote in studies of Pacific armor performance, illustrating how improvisation could complement formal doctrine. The legacy also reached training manuals for future armored units. While regulations remained strict, new emphasis was placed on understanding airflow, heat management, and the importance of adapting to local conditions. Field engineers were encouraged to recognize and report successful improvisations, transforming what was once an act of quiet defiance into institutional knowledge. Beyond hardware, the story highlighted a deeper truth about warfare. Victory often depends on small, unseen acts as much as large-scale maneuvers. While battles are remembered for the hills taken and the soldiers lost, the quiet triumphs, a tank that refused to stall, a mechanic who defied protocol, carry immense weight. On Saipan, one man's ingenuity preserved life, advanced strategy, and created a lesson in adaptive thinking that resonated far beyond the Pacific. By the end of the campaign, the Invincible Sherman had become more than a machine. It was a symbol of resilience, human ingenuity, and the unpredictable advantage that determination can yield in the chaos of war. The modifications it carried influenced armored operations for the remainder of the Pacific campaign, subtly shifting the balance in favor of those willing to think beyond the rules. Saipan had been won, but its lessons endured. In the heat, dust, and smoke of battle, one man's defiance had transformed not only a tank, but the entire way Marines and soldiers approached armored warfare. His work remained uncelebrated in official records, yet its impact echoed across islands, seas, and future generations of military engineers. War often celebrates strategy, heroism, and sweeping victories, yet its most profound lessons frequently arise in quiet corners, in workshops, under hulls, in the hands of a man willing to act when doctrine fails. The story of the Sherman on Saipan is one such lesson, a testament to ingenuity, courage, and the human ability to adapt under pressure. The unapproved cooling modification, forged in desperation and applied with precision, exemplifies the intimate connection between man and machine. In an environment designed to destroy both, it was a single mechanic's intuition, combined with relentless effort, that preserved lives and altered battlefield outcomes. The innovation transcended its technical roots, touching the psychological and moral dimensions of warfare. Crews trusted their machines, commanders could advance with confidence, and enemy forces confronted a resilience they could not anticipate. More than a mechanical adjustment, the incident symbolizes the broader ethos of wartime adaptation. Rules, manuals, and procedures exist to guide, Yet survival often requires bending the line between compliance and creativity. In Saipan, that line was crossed not recklessly but responsibly, with the well-being of men and the success of the mission in mind. It underscores a truth that resonates beyond military history. Progress frequently depends on those willing to think independently, to challenge norms when circumstances demand it. The modified Sherman also left a lasting imprint on armored warfare. Its success influenced post-battle technical manuals, informed design improvements, and shaped training for mechanics and crews in tropical environments. What began as an unauthorized tweak became codified knowledge, a bridge between field improvisation and institutional practice. Ultimately, the story of Saipan's Invincible Sherman is about more than engines, vents, or wrenches. It is about human resilience, the capacity to innovate amid chaos, and the quiet determination that can shift the tide of events. In the heat, smoke, and dust of the Pacific, one man's defiance created not only a machine that endured, but a narrative of ingenuity that endures to this day. The hills of Saipan no longer roar with artillery, yet in that silence, the echoes of human creativity and courage remain. It is a reminder that history is shaped as much by small, deliberate acts of ingenuity as by grand strategy, and that even in the darkest, most unforgiving moments, innovation can shine as brightly as any victory.